The Arctic convoys represented one of World War II's most arduous and strategically vital campaigns. These convoys were a precarious, non-stop maritime pipeline carrying essential war materials from the Western Allies to the Soviet Union. The journey traversed the treacherous North Atlantic and Arctic Ocean, a route infamous for its lethal blend of extreme cold and constant enemy attack. From 1941 to 1945, merchant ships sailed through freezing hell from ports in Scotland and Iceland toward the Soviet harbors of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. This narrow, frigid corridor was humanity's attempt to circumvent the U-boat-infested waters of the conventional Atlantic and the besieged ports of the Mediterranean. The stakes were existential, as the Soviet Union teetered on the brink of collapse following the initial hammer blows of Operation Barbarossa. Winston Churchill famously dubbed the route the worst journey in the world, a testament to the unimaginable suffering endured by the seamen. Temperatures plummeted far below zero, turning ship decks into skating rinks and rigging into brittle, weaponized ice formations. Any man falling overboard was condemned to a death measured in mere minutes within the paralyzing water. The environment itself was a more persistent and deadly enemy than any German torpedo or shell. Yet, beyond the brutal cold, the convoys had to contend with the full might of the German Air Force, U-boats, and their most powerful surface warships. The German military established naval and air bases in occupied Norway, perfectly positioned to launch devastating, unremitting attacks. Every mile gained by the slow, defenseless freighters was a victory clawed back from the jaws of meteorological and military disaster. The very success of the Soviet war effort, and perhaps the eventual outcome of the entire conflict, rested upon the thin, icy shoulders of these Allied supply lines. Without the raw materials, machinery, and food carried by these ships, the Red Army's resilience would have inevitably fractured. The convoys were a commitment by the West, often begrudgingly given and tragically paid for, to sustain the principal fighting force against the Third Reich. The desperation of the Soviet situation demanded this sacrifice, creating a logistical marvel fought against impossible odds. The tale of the Arctic convoys is one of human endurance, geopolitical necessity, and an unrelenting battle against nature and a determined foe. For Adolf Hitler, the Arctic convoys and the strategic value of Norway became a matter of personal and obsessive focus. He viewed the northern theater not merely as a defensive flank but as a crucial zone to exert massive pressure on Great Britain and the Soviet Union. The long, deep fjords of occupied Norway provided perfect, protected anchorages for Germany's powerful surface fleet. It was from these concealed bases that the mighty pocket battleships, heavy cruisers, and battlecruisers could suddenly emerge. Ships like the Tirpitz, known as the Lonely Queen of the North, represented an ever-present, crushing threat to the Allied convoys. Hitler was convinced that the presence of these capital ships alone was enough to pin down huge numbers of Allied naval assets, diverting them from other fronts. He was correct in this assessment, as the British Home Fleet was forced to maintain a substantial presence to counter the threat of a German breakout. The Führer's strategy prioritized the destruction of the supply convoys, believing they were the weak point in the Allied coalition. He often mocked the notion that such poorly defended, civilian ships could successfully navigate the German gauntlet. He allocated disproportionate resources to the Norwegian theater, sometimes against the better judgment of his own naval commanders. This northern obsession tied up German assets that could have been used more effectively in the Mediterranean or the U-boat war in the Atlantic. The German heavy cruisers and battleships were costly to maintain and operate in the harsh Arctic environment. The German propaganda machine relished in depicting the convoys as a futile gesture, an expensive parade of sinking ships and wasted Western effort. They boasted of the overwhelming power of the Kriegsmarine's Northern Fleet, promising the complete annihilation of the Soviet lifeline. This hubris, however, would prove to be a costly miscalculation of the strategic value and sheer volume of the aid being delivered. The deployment of immense, high-value ships on such a remote and unforgiving front was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. While the destruction of a single convoy could be a propaganda coup, the persistent survival of the convoy steadily eroded German strategic superiority. The fixation on surface raiding ultimately prevented the full concentration of German naval power where it might have been more decisive. The German Naval Command, particularly its surface fleet admirals, initially displayed open contempt for the Arctic convoys. They often referred to the merchant ships as expendable trinkets and their escorts as a tinker fleet composed of aging destroyers and converted trawlers. The Kriegsmarine, with its technologically superior U-boats and its few formidable capital ships, felt a profound sense of superiority. German intelligence frequently underestimated the resilience and the sheer defensive capability of the Allied escort groups. They considered the Lend-Lease aid being ferried to the Soviets to be of minimal military value, deeming the vast majority of it irrelevant surplus. The early sinkings, particularly the devastating losses inflicted upon the early convoys, fueled this German arrogance and disdain. The vast majority of the German Navy's strategy was built on the premise that the Allies would quickly abandon the route due to the catastrophic losses. Propaganda broadcasts in Germany regularly featured triumphant accounts of convoy raids, tallying the sunk tonnage with dismissive glee. They openly questioned the sanity of the Allied High Command for committing men and resources to such a seemingly hopeless venture. This mocking attitude was not simply propaganda, it permeated the operational planning and decision-making of the German surface fleet commanders. Their overconfidence led to a reliance on brute force and a lack of the nuanced, adaptive tactics necessary for prolonged Arctic warfare. The U-boat commanders saw the convoys as easy pickings, a dense, slow target offering little chance of serious reprisal. This underestimation of the convoys proved to be a profound error in strategic judgment that would cost the Axis dearly. The constant flow of shipping, even when severely depleted, meant that the Soviets were never entirely cut off from the stream of Western supplies. The mockery began to sour as the British escort groups developed more effective anti-submarine and anti-aircraft tactics. The relentless pressure of the convoys forced the Germans to commit more and more resources to the remote Arctic, diluting their overall war effort. The failure to completely break the supply line, despite early spectacular successes, was the first sign of a fatal strategic flaw. The nadir of the Allied Arctic convoy experience and the apex of German surface threat came with the destruction of convoy PQ-17. In June 1942, PQ-17 departed with 35 merchant ships carrying over 200,000 tons of crucial cargo for the Soviet war effort. It was one of the largest and most valuable convoys ever assembled for the treacherous journey to Archangel. The Germans mobilized their most powerful assets, including the battleship Tirpitz, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and several destroyers. The potential threat of the Tirpitz alone was enough to terrify the British Admiralty into a fateful decision. Misinterpreting intelligence and fearing a concerted attack by the German heavy ships, the Admiralty issued the disastrous order, "Convoy is to scatter." This single command was a death sentence for the vulnerable merchantman, transforming a cohesive, defended group into isolated prey. The escorting warships were withdrawn, leaving the slow-moving cargo vessels completely exposed to German U-boats and bomber aircraft. The scattering order was the ultimate expression of the German threat's psychological power over the Allied command. What followed was a ruthless, days-long hunt that became a textbook example of naval mass murder. The Germans, stunned by their luck, simply picked off the scattered ships one by one, using their air and submarine forces. 24 of the 35 merchant ships were sunk, representing a crushing loss of over two-thirds of the convoy's strength. The lost cargo included hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and vast quantities of aviation fuel and explosives. Operation Rosselsprung, or Knight's Move, was an enormous, undisputed tactical victory for the Kriegsmarine and a source of profound humiliation for the Allies. German propaganda hailed the event as the definitive end of the Arctic route, a complete failure of the Western war machine. The horror of PQ-17 demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of Germany's Northern Fleet when used decisively. It momentarily justified Hitler's faith in his battleships as fleet in being, forcing an entire convoy to sacrifice itself. The disaster caused a temporary suspension of the convoys and forced a complete, painful re-evaluation of Allied Arctic strategy. Despite the horrors like PQ-17, the cumulative tonnage delivered by the Arctic convoys was staggering and ultimately transformative. Over the course of the war, more than 4 million tons of supplies were delivered to the Soviet Union via the northern route. This vast quantity of material arrived despite the constant, terrifying presence of the German war machine. The terror on the route was not merely the fear of being sunk, but the sustained psychological assault of the Arctic itself. Seamen lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, where every ice-laden wave and every patch of fog could conceal a torpedo or a U-boat. The proximity to German airfields meant that enemy aircraft could appear with little warning, forcing crews to the frozen, exposed anti-aircraft guns. The relentless depth charge attacks launched by the escorts, designed to destroy U-boats, were often terrifying in their own right, shaking ships violently. The sheer volume of explosives being carried meant that a single hit could result in a catastrophic, instantaneous end for the entire crew. The ships often sailed under the eerie phenomenon of the midnight sun in summer, leaving them exposed to air attack around the clock. Conversely, the winter convoys endured the polar night, navigating in total darkness, a condition that amplified the terror of the unseen enemy. The British and American sailors who manned these merchant vessels were not professional soldiers but civilian mariners performing a military task. Their resilience under unimaginable pressure, often without adequate anti-aircraft protection, was a key factor in the convoy's eventual success. The cumulative attrition of men and ships created an atmosphere of fatalism mixed with grim determination among the crews. Yet, for every ship that sank, another sailed in its place, carrying the vital supplies that the Eastern Front desperately required. The story of the convoys is one of enduring, existential terror balanced against the absolute necessity of delivering the cargo. Every successful voyage was a triumph not just of logistics, but of sheer human courage over fear and the elements. The successful delivery of the Arctic convoys culminated in the logistical miracle performed at the receiving ports, chiefly Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Murmansk, located above the Arctic Circle, was the only Soviet port on the Kola Peninsula that remained ice-free year-round due to the North Atlantic Current. This unique geographical feature made it the single most critical choke point for the entire Lend-Lease program via the Arctic. German forces, aware of the port's importance, launched continuous and relentless bombing raids in a desperate attempt to render it unusable. The city and its harbor installations were subjected to some of the most concentrated aerial bombardment of the entire war. Yet, the Soviet workers and military personnel displayed extraordinary, unbreakable resilience under this constant, destructive pressure. They toiled around the clock in freezing conditions and under enemy fire to rapidly unload the Allied ships as soon as they docked. The swift turnaround of the freighters was essential to prevent them from becoming sitting targets for the next wave of German bombers. The enormous quantities of material had to be processed, sorted, and immediately transported hundreds of miles to the battlefronts. The Soviet rail network, already strained to its breaking point, was the only conduit for moving the supplies south to the fighting. This logistical challenge, often occurring in deep snow and on damaged lines, was a titanic effort of Soviet organization and labor. The operation was a testament to the Soviet will to survive, transforming the chaos of the front into an organized, albeit brutal, system of distribution. The Western Allies, too, played a part, often sending technical advisors and specialists to assist with the complex modern machinery being delivered. The miracle was not just in the ships arriving, but in the supplies being successfully integrated into the Red Army's supply chain, ready for immediate use. Every ton of steel and every gallon of fuel that survived the journey and the unloading process directly fueled the Soviet counterattacks. The continued function of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk under such duress proved the failure of the German strategy to interdict the aid supply. The true impact of the Arctic convoys lay not just in the volume but in the specific nature of the materials delivered. The supplies were not merely for aid, but the essential raw ingredients required to fully mechanize and sustain a modern, offensive army. Foremost among the shipments was high-quality steel and non-ferrous metals that the depleted Soviet industry desperately needed. Soviet factories relied on this imported raw material to maintain the production of their own tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. Rubber, a resource virtually unobtainable in sufficient quantities for the Soviets, arrived in huge quantities from the Allied convoys. Every truck, every tank, and every aircraft needed tires, and the imported rubber enabled the mobility of the Soviet forces. Explosives, including vast amounts of TNT and gunpowder, formed a crucial component of the delivered cargo. This explosive material ensured that the Soviet artillery, the god of war, could maintain its devastating, unceasing barrages. High-octane aviation fuel was delivered to power the thousands of new American Bell P-39 Airacobra and British Spitfire fighters. The delivery of modern radio equipment was also a game-changer, improving Soviet command and control, which had historically been poor. Perhaps less glamorous but equally vital were medical supplies, food concentrates, and hundreds of thousands of pairs of high-quality boots. The boots alone played an understated yet critical role in maintaining the health and operational capability of the Soviet infantry in brutal winters. The supplies allowed the Soviets to not only fight but to fight with a material quality that matched, and soon surpassed, the Wehrmacht. This infusion of specialized, high-grade material enabled a qualitative leap in Soviet military capability that homegrown production struggled to match. The entire Soviet logistics chain was slowly but surely reforged with this Western input, transforming it from a fragile system into a powerful engine of war. One of the single most transformative elements delivered by the Arctic convoys was the sheer volume of American transport vehicles. The iconic Studebaker US-6 truck, an unassuming but rugged 6x6 cargo vehicle, became the veritable backbone of the Red Army. Thousands upon thousands of these reliable, all-wheel drive trucks were shipped, providing a level of motorized mobility the Soviets could not replicate. Before the convoys, the Red Army was largely a foot mobile force, relying heavily on horses and poorly maintained Soviet-made trucks. The arrival of the Studebakers and other Lend-Lease vehicles allowed the Soviets to rapidly motorize their infantry and artillery components. This sudden, massive increase in mobility was a crucial prerequisite for launching the large-scale, deep penetration offensives that began after 1942. Soviet commanders could now execute rapid, complex maneuvers, moving vast amounts of men and supplies far faster than the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht, ironically, was often still reliant on horse-drawn transport for its supplies on the Eastern Front. The Lend-Lease trucks gave the Red Army a crucial logistical advantage, enabling them to close on and encircle German positions more effectively. Artillery batteries could be repositioned rapidly, and field hospitals could follow the advancing troops without delay. The vehicles also included ambulances, jeeps, and tank transporters, all contributing to the professionalization of the Soviet military machine. The speed and reliability of American transport allowed the Soviets to sustain their long, grinding advances deep into enemy territory. This was a direct contradiction to the German mockery that the convoys were delivering insignificant, unusable junk. The German army learned to dread the sound of the motorized Soviet columns, which signified a new, terrifying pace of battle. General Motors, Ford, and other American manufacturers effectively became uncredited but essential suppliers for the Red Army's logistical success. The strategic contribution of the Arctic convoys is perfectly illustrated by the Red Army's decisive shift from desperate defense to massive offense. The material accumulation made possible by the convoys coincided precisely with the pivotal turning points on the Eastern Front. The vast quantities of food, fuel, and vehicles delivered prior to the Battle of Stalingrad were instrumental in sustaining the encircled Soviet forces. The Lend-Lease trucks, in particular, were vital for the rapid assembly and execution of the devastating Soviet counter-offensive, Operation Uranus. This operation, which trapped the German Sixth Army, relied on the speed of motorized forces to seal the vast encirclement. The sustained supply lines meant that as the Soviets broke the siege and began their westward advance, they did not have to stop for lack of fuel or ammunition. At the colossal Battle of Kursk, the Allied aid allowed the Soviets to build up immense reserves of armor and artillery ammunition. The massive, prepared defensive lines at Kursk were backed by a logistical depth that dwarfed anything the Germans could amass. The Western supplies provided a crucial material cushion, allowing the Red Army to absorb the initial German onslaught and still possess the strength for a counterpunch. The consistent arrival of Lend-Lease aircraft also ensured that the Soviet Air Force could finally challenge and eventually dominate the Luftwaffe's air superiority. The convoys had effectively provided the essential, steady-state input required for the Soviet war industry to fully stabilize and then surge ahead. The transition from the agonizing defensive battles of 1941 and 1942 to the sweeping, strategic offensive of 1943 was materially underpinned by this foreign aid. The German High Command was baffled by the seemingly inexhaustible Soviet capacity to regenerate and launch massive attacks. This material resilience was a direct consequence of the unbroken Arctic lifeline, which their own forces had consistently failed to sever. The mockery ended when the supplies they dismissed were used to power the crushing offensives that drove the Wehrmacht backward, mile by bloody mile. The psychological and operational balance of power in the Arctic was decisively shattered by the sinking of the German battleship Sternhorst. This capital ship was one of the jewels of the Kriegsmarine, a fast and heavily armed raider that posed a constant, devastating threat to the convoys. In late December 1943, the Sternhorst sallied forth to attack convoy JW-55B, a crucial shipment heading to the Soviet Union. The British Admiralty, having learned the bitter lessons of PQ-17, was prepared for the surface threat this time. The venerable British battleship HMS Duke of York, along with several cruisers and destroyers, was deployed to intercept the German raider. In the ensuing Battle of North Cape, the British forces executed a flawless tactical engagement in the darkness of the polar night. The Duke of York's heavy shells, guided by superior radar, crippled the Sternhorst, slowing her retreat and disabling her main armament. The subsequent torpedo and gun attacks by the British destroyers proved relentless and ultimately fatal for the German ship. The sinking of the Sternhorst marked the end of the German surface fleet as a credible, sustained threat to the Arctic convoys. With the largest and most capable German surface ships eliminated or bottled up, the entire dynamic of the northern route changed instantly. Hitler's northern obsession was dealt a grievous blow, and the German High Command began to withdraw their remaining heavy units from Norway. The defeat demonstrated that the Allies had mastered the combination of radar, intelligence, and naval coordination in the unforgiving Arctic. The subsequent convoys, while still facing U-boat and air attacks, could sail with a vastly reduced fear of sudden, overwhelming surface action. The strategic failure of the Sternhorst mission effectively handed the British Navy undisputed control over the sea lanes of the Arctic. This victory in the frozen wastes ensured the continued, unimpeded flow of the very materials that were fueling the Red Army's advance. The tide had not merely turned in the north. The key German weapon in the battle against the convoys had been permanently removed from play. The eventual, crushing price paid by Germany was a direct result of its contemptuous underestimation of the Arctic convoys. The German leadership, from Hitler down to the operational commanders, never truly grasped the transformative power of Western industrial output. They mocked the convoys, dismissing them as a nuisance, failing to see them as the logistical foundation for their own defeat. Their focus remained largely tactical, aiming for spectacular sinkings rather than a sustained, strategic interdiction campaign. The Kriegsmarine failed to allocate the necessary U-boats and air assets to choke the supply line completely. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had a virtually bottomless reservoir of manpower, which was only awaiting the necessary equipment to be fully effective. The convoys provided that necessary material catalyst, translating Soviet resilience into offensive power. The price of German contempt was the eventual material superiority of the Red Army on the Eastern Front. The Soviet forces were increasingly equipped with modern communication equipment, reliable transport, and high-quality weaponry. This material advantage allowed the Soviets to sustain momentum over vast distances, a feat the German logistics system could never match. The continuous delivery of Lend-Lease fuel and vehicles enabled the deep operations doctrine to be executed with devastating effectiveness. By the time the Germans realized the scale of the material they had allowed to pass, it was far too late to reverse the strategic imbalance. The German High Command was left to wonder where the Red Army was sourcing its endless supply of new trucks and high-grade fuel. The answer lay in the icy graves of the Arctic, where countless sailors had died to ensure the aid reached its destination. The final irony was that the very convoys they mocked were delivering the component of the weapon that would ultimately destroy the Third Reich. The psychological warfare of German ridicule was utterly negated by the physical reality of American steel and British resolve. The final act of the Arctic convoy saga was the Red Army's vengeful drive that began on the Eastern Front and ended in Berlin. The massive Soviet armies that crossed the Vistula and Oder rivers were no longer the ragged, ill-equipped units of 1941. They were a fully motorized, well-equipped, and formidably supplied military machine, capable of sustaining multi-front, deep penetration offensives. The relentless pursuit of the Wehrmacht across Poland and into the German heartland was materially enabled by the convoyed supplies. Lend-Lease trucks towed the vast quantities of Soviet artillery pieces that pulverized German defenses from afar. The high-octane fuel and maintenance kits kept the Soviet tank armies rolling at a pace that gave the Germans no time to rest or regroup. The boots, rations, and medical supplies ensured that the Red Army infantry could maintain its morale and physical health through the final, brutal campaign. The retribution delivered upon the Rhine was the fulfillment of the Allied sacrifice in the freezing north. Every shell fired by a Soviet gun and every mile driven by a Soviet vehicle carried a material connection to the perilous Arctic journey. The German strategic blunder of not prioritizing the complete closure of the Arctic route ultimately guaranteed the Soviet capacity for final victory. The sheer industrial weight of the Allied war effort, delivered through the frozen gauntlet, was the decisive factor on the largest front of the war. The story of the convoys transitioned from a tale of agonizing defense into the legend of the logistical backbone of Soviet triumph. The German mocking of the useless convoys had allowed an unstoppable stream of material to pour into the Soviet Union. This stream eventually coalesced into the overwhelming, vengeful force that swept across Europe and led to the final collapse of the Third Reich. The men who sailed the Arctic route had done more than deliver cargo, they had delivered the means of Soviet retribution.